name's Amanda and welcome to the very last tutorial in my mini block quilt along. So in this video we are tying everything up into a lovely neat little bow and finishing our quilt tops. So in this video I will be showing you how to sash all of your gorgeous little blocks together and then put the borders on, and then we will be basting and quilting it, and then we will be doing our very easy binding that I usually do. And then I will also show you how to make a rod pocket and attach it to your quilt, and then also labeling it, and then it's done. You'll find in this tutorial some elements I do go into a little bit more depth, and then a few others I just sort of skim over because I'm assuming you will know the knowledge and that you've done it before, and then you've got your own sort of plan for that little part. For the final layout I've actually created two versions for you to choose between. There's version 1, which is just a really basic layout with just sashing and borders, and then version 2 is something a little bit more different, and it's the version that I'm doing in this tutorial. Version 1 is a little bit smaller, and then version 2 creates a little bit more of a bigger quilt. As always, it is completely up to you which version you would like to do. You don't even have to do either of them. You can do something completely different and be a little bit more creative and free. It is completely up to you how you want to finish this. There are no sort of restraints or limitations. It's completely your choice. As always, you will find all of the measurement and cutting instructions for the version that I'm making in the description box below. There is also a link to both version and version 2 layouts in the description that you can click on and download and print and follow. So I think I've said everything I need to say for this little bit. So let's get into how we finish our lovely mini block sampler quilts. To begin, grab your 9 finished blocks along with 6 1.5 by 5.5 inch strips and 2 1.5 by 17.5 inch strips from your background fabric. Lay out 3 blocks that will form your first row. Place 2 smaller sashing strips on either side of the middle block. Turn the first sashing strip over onto your first block and evenly pin it into place. Sew a 1/4 inch seam along this edge and then gently press the seam towards the sashing with a medium to hot steamy iron. Flip the next block over and pin it into place. Sew a 1/4 inch seam down this edge and then press the seam towards the sashing strip. Turn the next sashing strip over, pin, sew and press it into place. Then piece the last block to the end of the row in the same way. Then repeat the same steps to piece together the other 2 rows of blocks in the quilt top. Next, place the 2 longer sashing strips in the center between the rows. Turn the top sashing strip over onto the bottom edge of the top row and evenly pin it into place. Sew a 1/4 inch seam along the pinned edge and then gently press the seam inwards towards the sashing strip. Flip the top row over onto the middle one and line up the center parallel sashing strips with the ones in the middle row. Pin the top edge evenly into place and sew a 1/4 inch seam along it. Then press the seam towards the sashing strip once more. From here, repeat the same set of steps to piece together the second sashing strip and the last row into place. For the borders, you will need to cut from your background fabric 1 4.5 by 17.5 inch strip, 1 4.5 inch by 21.5 inch strip, along with 1 10.5 by 21.5 inch strip, and then 1 10.5 by 31.5 inch strip. Place the 4.5 by 17.5 inch border strip along the right hand side of the pieced blocks. Evenly pin it into place and sew a 1/4 inch seam along this edge. Then press the seam outwards towards the border piece. Lay out the 4.5 by 21.5 inch border strip along the bottom edge of the piece blocks. Pin it into place and sew a 1/4 inch seam along it. Then press the seam outwards towards the bottom border piece. Next, place the 10.5 by 21.5 inch border piece along the left hand side of the pieced blocks, and then pin, piece and press the strip into place. Then finally, piece the last border piece along the top edge of the quilt blocks in the same way to finish the quilt top. Next, lay out your 35 by 35 inch backing fabric and batting and place your finished quilt top on top. Then baste the layers together using your preferred basting method. I'm basting my layers with the Birch quilt basting spray and then pressing the layers flat, starting from the center and working my way out to the edges. Then, at the sewing machine, quilt in the way you choose best for your quilt. I've opted for simple, straight line quilting. Once you've finished quilting, carefully trim away the excess batting and backing from around the edges of the quilt using a ruler and blade. To make the binding, cut 4 2.5 inch strips from your binding fabric. To join them together, place one strip end on top of another strip end, with one selvage at the top and the other facing towards the left. Pin them securely together and then carefully sew a 45-degree line through the center of where the two strips overlap. Continue to sew one binding strip to another in the same way, creating a long, continuous binding strip. With a ruler and blade, trim off each of the selvage triangles, leaving behind a 1/4 inch seam allowance. To create the starting end of the binding, place the 45-degree line on your ruler along the bottom edge of the binding strip. Trim off the top corner and then, by eye, fold and press the end over to a 1/4 inch seam. From here, carefully press the whole length of the binding in half with a medium to hot steamy iron, while making sure to press the seam joints flat open as you reach them. At the sewing machine, place the beginning of the binding along the bottom edge of the quilt, leaving about 1 to 2 inches of binding behind your walking foot. With the raw edges of the quilt top and binding lined up evenly, make a small back stitch and begin sewing the binding into place using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As you reach a corner, make a small back stitch about a 1/4 inch away from the edge and remove the quilt from the machine. Turn the quilt around to the next edge and then fold the binding up onto itself, creating a 45-degree angle. With the top of the fold lining up with the corner of the quilt, fold the binding back over, creating a straight fold along the top edge. Carefully place the quilt and folded binding back under the machine foot. Make a small back stitch and continue sewing the binding on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you make it back to where you first started, cut off the excess binding, leaving behind enough to tuck into the beginning end of the binding. Carefully sew the two tucked ends together, finishing with a small back stitch. Then fold the binding over to the back of the quilt using binding clips to hold it into place. Then by hand, patiently stitch the binding into place using a method you feel most comfortable with. To make the rod pocket, cut a 5 by 30 inch strip from your leftover backing fabric. By eye, fold each of the smaller ends over twice, roughly measuring a 1/4 inch. Press with the iron and pin into place if you like. Then at the sewing machine, sew each of the folded ends into place. Next, press the strip in half with right sides facing out, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam along the entirety of the raw edge, creating a small back stitch at the start and finish. Roll this seam into the center of the newly created fabric tube and gently press it open with the iron. With the open seam to the back, gently roll the top pressed edge over towards you, about 1/2 inch. Carefully press with the iron, creating another folded edge. Place the rod pocket at the top back side of the quilt, leaving about 1/2 inch allowance from the binding at the top and sides. Once happy with its position, pin the bottom edge of the pocket into place, then roll back the top edge and pin the second pressed edge into place. Then by hand, carefully sew the rod pocket into place along the second top fold and bottom edge fold using a whip stitch and without pulling the thread to the top side of the quilt. Lastly, label your finished quilt with its name, completion date and who made it, and then secure it in the way you feel most familiar with. For mine, I made my usual hexi flower label. For a more in-depth tutorial, click the link in the top right corner, or you can find it in the description box below. So that's it, friends. The series is finished, and I would just like to say a big huge thank you to everyone who has taken part and for sharing your lovely blocks, and also, I'm saying this in advance, for sharing your beautiful finished quilts with me. I really do love it when you share the things that you have made by following my tutorials. You guys are just awesome, and the support that you give me is just wonderful, and I can't say thank you enough because I just can't. I mean, it's just not possible. As I always say at this part, please keep sharing your blocks with me and the rest of our lovely community. You can do that by using the hashtag Amanda's Mini QAL. If you are making this in the future, if you're making this a year from now, 2 years from now, please do share your blocks. I will be checking that hashtag all the time. This series will be up on my YouTube channel forever. If you're not doing it like here and now, February 2019, but further on in the future, just share because I love seeing it. Again, thank you all so much for joining me in another quilt along series on my channel. I'm not sure when the next time I will do one. It won't be anytime soon, I know that. But I do love making them, and I do love that you guys interact and sew along and enjoy what I do, because I enjoy what I do as well. So with that, friends, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again another time very soon. Bye!